Imagine coming home after a long, relaxing weekend away, only to find your personal sanctuary turned into a scene from a psychological thriller. In the year 2014, a young married couple lived in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood in Seattle, Washington. They had spent their weekend out of town visiting some of their close family members, and they were looking forward to nothing more than getting back to their house, unpacking their bags, and getting a good night of sleep before the busy work week started. The drive back had been long, and the highway traffic was heavy. When they finally pulled their car into their driveway, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across their front lawn. Everything looked completely normal from the outside. The green grass was cut, the windows were fully intact, and the front door was closed tightly. The husband grabbed their suitcases from the trunk, and the wife walked up the concrete steps to the front porch. She pulled her keys out of her purse, unlocked the front door, and pushed it open. But the second she stepped over the threshold into the entryway, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her husband, carrying the heavy bags, bumped right into her from behind. He asked her why she was standing there, but she did not answer. She just pointed into the house. When the husband looked past her shoulder, his jaw dropped. Their home was not just messy. It was absolutely destroyed, but in ways that did not make any logical sense. It did not look like a typical robbery where someone runs in, grabs the television, and searches the drawers for expensive jewelry. It looked like the work of someone who was completely detached from reality. The first thing that caught their attention was their collection of shoes. They kept a neat row of shoes in their entryway closet. Someone had pulled every single pair of shoes out of the closet and lined them up on the floor. But then, this person had taken the time to meticulously rip the inner soles out of every single shoe, tearing them into small pieces and leaving them scattered across the floor. The couple slowly walked further into the house, their hearts pounding in their chests. They walked into the kitchen, and the scene was even more chaotic. Their mail, which had been sitting neatly on the counter, had been torn into thousands of tiny microscopic pieces. These paper scraps were scattered all over the kitchen floor, looking like a bizarre layer of paper snow. On the kitchen table, several items had been knocked over, but nothing of value was missing. They walked toward the hallway bathroom, and what they found there made them shudder. A brand new, large can of White House paint had been taken from their garage. The lid had been completely pried off, and the entire can had been flipped upside down directly on top of the toilet seat. Thick, sticky white paint was slowly seeping out from under the rim, running down the sides of the porcelain bowl and pooling on the tile floor. It was a complete mess, but it made no sense. Why would a burglar do something like that? They walked down the hallway toward their master bedroom, their hands shaking as they turned the doorknobs. And that is when they noticed another highly unsettling detail. Several of the doorknobs in the house felt incredibly greasy and slick. When they shined their phone flashlights on them, they realized that someone had coated the metal handles in a thick, heavy layer of hand lotion. It made it incredibly difficult to grip and turn the knobs. When they finally managed to open the door to their bedroom, they saw that the room had been completely ransacked. Every single drawer from their dresser had been pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Their clothes were thrown everywhere in a chaotic pile. But as they looked around the messy room, their eyes were drawn to the door of their master bathroom. There was a random piece of wood about 2 feet long, wedged tightly in the gap between the door and the doorframe. The couple had never seen this piece of wood before. It did not belong to them, and they had no idea where it came from. Stranger still, a single metal screw had been driven directly into the center of the wood. Yet, the wood was not actually blocking the bathroom door from being opened. It was just sitting there, wedged in the frame, serving absolutely no practical purpose whatsoever. It was as if someone had placed it there as some sort of strange symbolic marker. And then, the wife's eyes drifted to the center of their bed. Lying directly on top of the mattress was a small leather purse. The wife knew instantly that it did not belong to her. She cautiously walked over, unzipped the purse, and looked inside. Sitting right on top of some personal items was an identification card. The card belonged to a 27-year-old woman with pale skin and dark hair. Neither the husband nor the wife had ever seen this woman before in their lives. At this exact moment, a cold wave of absolute terror washed over the couple. They realized that whoever had done this, whoever had spent hours meticulously destroying their home in these bizarre ways, might still be inside the house. They could be hiding in the dark master closet, or standing behind the shower curtain in the bathroom. They did not want to wait around to find out. They grabbed each other's hands, ran out of the bedroom, sprinted down the hallway, and burst through the front door. They ran down the steps, scrambled into their car, locked the doors, and immediately dialed 911. Within 10 minutes, several police officers arrived at the scene. They drew their weapons and entered the home, conducting a thorough room-by-room sweep of the entire property. They checked every closet, crawled into the attic space, searched the garage, and looked behind every door. But after 30 minutes, the officers walked back outside to the couple's car. They looked completely baffled. The officers explained that they had searched every square inch of the house and there was absolutely no one inside. Furthermore, they had checked all the windows and doors, and there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing of value, like the electronics or the wife's actual jewelry, had been stolen. It appeared that an intruder had somehow entered the home, spent hours performing these strange, senseless acts of vandalism, and then simply walked away. Because there was no active threat, the officers told the couple they would head back to the station to write up a standard report. They advised the couple to lock their doors securely, stay alert, and call them back if they noticed anything else out of the ordinary. Once the police cruisers drove away, the couple stood in their quiet home, feeling incredibly vulnerable. The sense of safety they had always felt in their house was completely gone. But they knew they could not live in the mess forever. They decided to roll up their sleeves and begin the long process of cleaning. They spent the next several hours picking up the thousands of shredded pieces of mail, wiping the thick layers of hand lotion off the doorknobs, and trying to clean the sticky white paint from the bathroom floor. By the time midnight rolled around, they were completely exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The husband looked at the remaining piles of clothes on the bedroom floor and decided they would finish the cleanup in the morning. They turned off the lights, climbed into their bed, and pulled the covers up, trying to block out the unsettling events of the day. For about an hour, the house was completely silent. The couple lay there in the dark, listening to the normal, quiet sounds of the house settling. They were just starting to drift off to sleep when a sound broke the silence. It was a very low, muffled, agonizing sound. It sounded like a small animal slowly dying. The couple froze, their eyes wide in the darkness. The sound was coming from directly beneath their bed. They lay completely still, barely breathing, trying to identify what they were hearing. The husband knew that their bed frame was a very modern, low-profile design. It sat incredibly low to the ground, with barely any clearance between the floor and the underside of the mattress. It was so tight that they could not even slide a standard storage box under it. Because of this, they were convinced that no human being could possibly fit under there. They figured that during the hours they had been cleaning with the front door open, a stray cat, a raccoon, or some other small wild animal must have slipped inside and crawled under the bed. But as the sound continued, a low, wet, scratching noise accompanied by a strange, raspy breathing, the couple's instincts screamed at them that something was terribly wrong. They decided they were not going to stick their heads down to look. They quietly and carefully slid out of the bed, sprinted out of the master bedroom, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and ran out of the house. For the second time that night, they sat in their car and dialed 911. When the police arrived back at the home, they walked into the master bedroom with their flashlights drawn. The officers approached the bed, knelt down, and shined their lights into the tiny gap beneath the frame. What they saw made them recoil in shock. Squeezed into the impossibly tight space beneath the bed was a human being. It was a 90-pound, 27-year-old woman. She was completely covered in dirt and sweat, and her eyes were wild and unfocused. She was severely high on methamphetamine, and she was clutching a sharp hunting knife in one hand and a loaded hypodermic needle in the other. It turned out she was the exact same woman whose identification card they had found in the purse earlier. And she had not just been hiding under there. She had been using her knife to actively claw and burrow a hole directly into the underside of the wooden bed frame, trying to create a pocket inside the mattress where she could hide permanently. During her interrogation, the police reconstructed exactly what had happened. While the couple was away, the woman had wandered onto their property. She had climbed up a large, sturdy tree that grew right next to the side of the house, navigated her way onto a small ledge, and slipped through an unlocked second-story window. Once inside, in her drug-induced state, she had spent hours systematically vandalizing the home in the most bizarre ways. When she heard the couple's car pull up the driveway, she had panicked. She knew she could not escape through the lower levels without being seen, so she ran into the master bedroom and squeezed her small 90-pound frame into the tiny clearance beneath the bed. Because the space was so incredibly tight, the couple had never even thought to look under there during their initial walkthrough, and the police officers, assuming no human could possibly fit in such a small gap, had failed to check under the bed during their sweep. For hours, while the couple was walking around the room, cleaning up the mess, and eventually lying down to sleep, this armed, highly unstable, and dangerous woman was lying just inches beneath their bodies, silently scratching at the wood. It was an absolute miracle that she had not attacked them in their sleep. The woman was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, but the couple immediately sold the house, unable to ever sleep in that bedroom again. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes place in the summer of 2020. This is the incredibly bizarre and baffling case of 18-year-old Gia Fuda. To understand this story, you have to understand who Gia was. She was a bright, happy, and highly motivated young woman who lived with her loving parents in a comfortable home in Seattle, Washington. Gia was deeply close to her family, and she had a very structured, predictable routine. But like millions of other young people around the world in 2020, Gia's life had been completely upended by the global pandemic and the strict quarantine measures that followed. All of her classes at Bellevue College, a respected institution located just outside of the Seattle metropolitan area, had been moved entirely online. Gia was an active, energetic person who thrived on social interaction and physical movement. Being forced to stay inside her parents' house all day, staring at a computer screen, began to take a major toll on her. She told her mother that she felt trapped, claustrophobic, and unable to focus on her studies within the four walls of her bedroom. To cope with this, Gia developed a new daily routine that allowed her to get out of the house while still complying with safety guidelines. Every single morning, she would wake up early, get dressed, grab her laptop, and drive to the Bellevue College campus. Although the main buildings were closed, she found comfort in sitting in her car in the quiet campus parking lot, or sitting on the empty outdoor benches near the library where she could connect to the school's wireless internet and do her schoolwork in peace. She would spend the entire day there, focusing on her classes, and then return home just in time for dinner with her parents. It was a healthy, positive routine that gave her a sense of normalcy during a highly chaotic time. On the morning of July 24th, 2020, everything started out exactly the same. Gia woke up early, walked down to the kitchen, and saw her mother and father preparing breakfast. She greeted them with a warm smile, grabbed a cold can of seltzer water from the refrigerator, and took a few sips. She grabbed her backpack, looked at her parents, and said, "Okay, I'll see you guys tonight." She walked out the door, got into her car, and drove down the quiet suburban street. Her parents smiled, assuming she was heading to her usual spot at Bellevue College to study. But on this particular morning, Gia did not go to Bellevue College. Instead of taking the exit toward the campus, Gia hopped onto the main highway and began driving east, away from Seattle. She drove for nearly 60 miles, leaving the urban sprawl behind and entering the deeply rural, heavily forested wilderness of Washington state. This area is dominated by the Cascade Mountain Range, a vast, rugged, and dense forest that stretches for hundreds of miles. Eventually, Gia arrived in a tiny remote town called Index, Washington. Index is a very small community nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by towering pine trees and steep, rocky cliffs. It is a place where tourists and hikers often stop to grab supplies before heading into the deep wilderness. At around mid-morning, a security camera inside a small local coffee shop in Index captured Gia walking through the front door. She looked completely calm and relaxed. She ordered a cup of hot coffee, chatted politely with the cashier, and paid with her card. But then, she did something a bit unusual. She walked over to a display of local souvenirs and purchased a small plastic keychain shaped like Bigfoot. She attached it to her keys, walked back out to her car, and kept driving. She drove another 30 miles deeper into the mountains, away from any signs of civilization. It remains completely unclear where she was going or what was going through her mind, because she did not have any friends or family in that area, and she had never expressed any interest in visiting this remote region before. As she was driving along a remote stretch of Highway 2, her car suddenly ran completely out of gas. It was clear that she was totally unprepared for this to happen. The car died so suddenly that she did not have enough momentum to pull completely off the road. She was only able to steer the vehicle slightly onto the narrow shoulder of the highway, leaving the rear end of her car jutting out into the active lane of traffic. This awkward, unsafe positioning would prove to be a crucial detail later on. When her car stopped, Gia was in a highly vulnerable position. She was miles away from any town, and her car was dead. In a normal situation, a person would walk along the side of the highway to find help, or stand near the vehicle to flag down a passing motorist. If they had cellular service, they would call a towing company or their parents. But Gia did not do any of those things. Instead, she grabbed her cell phone, her heavy leather-bound Bible, and her personal journal from the passenger seat. She stepped out of her car, shut the door, and turned her back on the highway. She walked directly toward an incredibly steep, heavily forested mountain that bordered the road. Without hesitation, she began climbing straight up into the dense, dark forest, navigating through thick brush, fallen logs, and steep, rocky terrain. It is incredibly important to note that this specific region of the Cascade Mountains where Gia chose to enter is known by search and rescue professionals as a highly dangerous area. Experts in unexplained disappearances have pointed out that over the years, at least a dozen other people have vanished under highly mysterious and baffling circumstances in this exact same section of the forest. Many of these cases have been highlighted in missing person documentations due to their strange, unexplainable patterns. By 11:30 that night, back in Seattle, Gia's parents were growing extremely frantic. Gia had never, in her entire life, missed her curfew without calling. They had been trying to text and call her for hours, but every single call went straight to voicemail, and their text messages remained unread. They called her friends, but no one had seen or heard from her all day. By 1 o'clock in the morning, her father called the local police department to report her missing. Realizing the potential danger, the authorities immediately launched a massive search and rescue operation. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers, professional search teams, tracking dogs, and helicopters equipped with advanced thermal imaging technology were deployed to the area. Very early in the search, a state trooper spotted Gia's car parked awkwardly on the shoulder of Highway 2 near Index. The car was locked, and when they looked inside, they saw her computer bag and other personal belongings still sitting on the seat. But there was no sign of Gia. The searchers quickly ran into a massive obstacle. The deep mountain valleys of the Cascades are notorious for having zero cell phone reception. It was a complete dead zone. This meant that the police could not ping Gia's phone to get a GPS coordinate, and they could not track her movements. They were completely blind, forced to search a massive, rugged, and vertical wilderness on foot. For days, the search continued under grueling conditions. Teams of searchers climbed up steep rock faces, pushed through dense briars, and searched deep ravines. Helicopters flew overhead using infrared cameras to scan the forest canopy for any heat signatures. But as the days turned into a week, they found absolutely nothing. There were no footprints, no broken branches, and no items left behind. In the harsh mountain environment, where temperatures dropped significantly at night and wild predators like cougars and bears roamed free, the chances of an 18-year-old girl surviving for 7 days with no food, shelter, or proper gear were practically non-existent. The search coordinators began to prepare Gia's family for the very real possibility that they were now conducting a recovery operation rather than a rescue. Then, on the 7th day of the search, a team of volunteers who had pushed several miles deep into the forest made a stunning discovery. They had climbed up to a beautiful, remote clearing near a scenic mountain creek. As they walked along the bank, one of the searchers spotted something bright lying on the ground. They rushed over and found a neat pile of items. It was Gia's jacket, her shoes, her cell phone, her personal journal, and her Bible. It looked as though she had simply stopped by the creek, taken off her jacket and her shoes, laid them neatly on the ground alongside her most precious belongings, and then walked away barefoot into the freezing wilderness. While finding her belongings gave the searchers a starting point, it sent a wave of absolute terror through her parents. In search and rescue, finding a missing person's clothing in the deep woods after a week is usually a very bad omen. It is often a sign of terminal burrowing and paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon caused by severe hypothermia where a person's brain falsely tells them they are burning up, causing them to strip off their clothes right before they pass away. But the searchers refused to give up. They focused all of their canine units and ground teams on the area immediately surrounding the creek, searching every thicket and rock crevice for the next 48 hours. On the 9th day since Gia had vanished, a team of searchers was pushing through a dense thicket of bushes about a mile upstream from where her clothes had been found. They stepped into a small, sunny clearing, and there, sitting quietly on a large flat rock near the water, was Gia. She was alive. When the searchers slowly approached her, calling out her name, Gia jumped in surprise. She looked incredibly startled to see other human beings, as if she had completely forgotten that anyone else existed. She was in a highly disoriented, dreamlike state. She was severely emaciated, her skin was pale, and she was covered in dirt and scratches, but miraculously, she was alive and stable. When the medics began treating her, she told them that she had only been lost in the woods for about 3 days. And she was completely shocked when they explained that she had been missing for 9 full days. She had survived by drinking fresh water from the creek and foraging for wild huckleberries that grew abundantly in the clearing. But when the investigators began to gently question her about why she had gone missing, the story became even more baffling. Gia had absolutely no memory of why she had driven to Index, why she had bought the Bigfoot keychain, or why she had abandoned her car to walk up the mountain. Even more chillingly, she had a complete total memory blackout regarding the first 7 days of her disappearance. She had no idea where she had slept, how she had lost her shoes and jacket, or what she had done. Her memory only began on the 8th day when she woke up sitting on the rock by the creek. To this day, the mystery of Gia Fuda's journey into the Cascade Mountains remains completely unsolved, a strange and baffling tale of survival that leaves us with far more questions than answers. Now we move to our third story, which takes place in the spring of 2008 in the flat, open farmland of western Minnesota. This is the tragic and deeply unsettling disappearance of 19-year-old Brandon Swanson. To understand the geography of this area, you have to picture miles and miles of gravel roads cutting through vast, empty agricultural fields. It is a region where the towns are incredibly small, often separated by miles of dark, open space. Brandon was a quiet, sensible young man who was close to his family and had a bright future ahead of him. He was completing his sophomore year at a small community college in Canby, Minnesota. Canby was a tiny town of just under 1,000 residents where everyone knew everyone. Brandon's family lived in Marshall, a slightly larger town located about 30 miles to the southeast. May 13, 2008 was the last day of classes for the spring semester. It was a major milestone for Brandon as he had successfully completed his community college coursework and was preparing to transfer to a prestigious 4-year university in the fall. To celebrate, Brandon and his classmates decided to attend some casual end-of-the-year parties. These were not wild, out-of-control parties. They were typical small-town gatherings, mostly outdoor barbecues held at friends' homes in the countryside around Canby. Brandon spent the evening socializing, laughing, and saying goodbye to his classmates. Shortly after midnight, Brandon decided he was exhausted and ready to make the 30-mile drive back to his parents' house in Marshall. Normally, the safest and most direct route between Canby and Marshall was Highway 68, a well-lit, paved two-lane highway. But for some reason, perhaps to avoid late-night traffic or simply because he preferred the quiet, Brandon decided to navigate his way home using a network of gravel country roads. When investigators later interviewed the students who had been at the parties with Brandon that night, they asked if Brandon had been heavily drinking. Every single witness gave the exact same account. They stated that Brandon had been completely sober. He had been seen holding a single beer throughout the entire evening, but he had barely sipped it. They all agreed he was completely lucid, clear-headed, and simply very tired and ready to sleep. As Brandon was driving down one of the dark, unmarked gravel roads, he made a slight steering error on a sharp curve. His car slid off the loose gravel and plunged into a deep, steep, agricultural ditch on the side of the road. The car was not severely damaged, but the wheels were spinning uselessly in the soft mud at the bottom of the ditch. He was completely stuck. At first, Brandon tried to call several of his college friends to see if anyone had a truck with a winch who could pull him out. But because it was past 1 o'clock in the morning, no one answered their phones. Feeling a bit embarrassed to wake up his parents, but realizing he had no other option, Brandon finally dialed his home number. His mother answered, and Brandon explained what had happened. He assured her that he was completely uninjured, but that his car was stuck in a ditch near the small town of Lind, Minnesota, and gave them detailed directions, explaining exactly which gravel roads he had taken. He asked if they could drive out and help him get the car loose. His parents immediately agreed. Brandon's father got behind the wheel of their car with Brandon's mother in the passenger seat, and they headed toward the area near Lind. When they arrived in the general vicinity of the roads Brandon had described, Brandon's father called him back on his cell phone to coordinate. His father explained that they had reached the gravel road and asked Brandon to look out for their headlights. His father began repeatedly flashing their high beams, driving slowly down the dark road, expecting Brandon to say he saw them. But Brandon, who was still active on the phone, said the area around him was completely pitch black. He could not see any headlights or flashing lights whatsoever. Brandon's father grew confused. He asked Brandon to describe his surroundings. Brandon explained that he was standing next to his car, looking out over a wide field, and that he was absolutely certain he was near Lind. To try and bridge the gap, Brandon got back into his own car and began flashing his headlights, asking his parents if they could see him. But his parents looked out over the flat landscape and saw nothing but darkness. Both parties began to grow increasingly frustrated, wondering if they were on the wrong roads. Brandon's father asked if he was sure he had given them the right directions. Brandon, feeling confident in his navigation, insisted he was in the right place. Finally, Brandon decided to take matters into his own hands. He looked out across the dark fields and spotted a distinct, bright cluster of lights shining in the distance. He was convinced those lights belonged to the town of Lind. He told his father, "Listen, this is silly. I can see the lights of Lind right over there. It can't be more than a 30-minute walk. I have a friend who lives in Lind, and I can just walk to his house and get some help. I'm going to start walking toward the lights, and we can just stay on the phone while I walk." Brandon's father agreed, thinking this was a sensible plan. He and Brandon's mother stayed in their car while his father remained on the line, listening to the steady sound of Brandon's footsteps crunching on the gravel road. During the call, which lasted for 47 minutes, Brandon spoke completely calmly. His father later emphasized to the police that Brandon sounded completely normal, coherent, and relaxed. He was describing the chilly night air, the fields he was passing, and how the lights in the distance were slowly getting closer. But as they were talking about his plans for the upcoming summer, Brandon's tone suddenly changed. He did not yell or scream. He simply let out a sharp, sudden gasp and said, "Oh shit!" And then the call went completely silent. Brandon's father frantically screamed his son's name into the receiver, but there was no reply. He hung up and immediately redialed the number, but the call went straight to his son's voicemail. Terrified, Brandon's parents drove frantically through the network of gravel roads, flashing their lights and calling out of the windows, but they found absolutely nothing. As soon as the sun rose, they contacted the local sheriff's department. When the police began their investigation, they obtained Brandon's cell phone records to see which cell towers had routed his 47-minute call. To everyone's utter disbelief, the records showed that Brandon was nowhere near Lind, Minnesota. He was actually over 25 miles away, in a completely different direction, near a small town called Taunton. The realization sent a shockwave through the search teams. Brandon had been completely lost, walking in the opposite direction of where he believed he was, toward a set of lights that did not belong to Lind. A massive search was launched around the Taunton area. Searchers soon located Brandon's abandoned car, stuck in a ditch exactly as he had described near the Yellow Medicine River. But there was no sign of Brandon. Search dogs tracked his scent from the car, leading down a gravel road and through a field toward the banks of the rushing river. The scent trail ended abruptly at the water's edge. This led investigators to believe that Brandon may have accidentally slipped into the fast-flowing river in the dark and drowned. But despite extensive searches of the river using boats, divers, and high-tech sonar equipment over several months, no body, clothing, or phone was ever recovered. Furthermore, some search dogs later picked up his scent on the opposite side of the river, suggesting he may have crossed the water and continued walking into the dark. The mystery of what Brandon saw, what caused him to gasp, and what those lights were that he was walking toward has never been solved. To this day, Brandon's family leaves their front porch light burning every single night, holding on to the hope that he will one day find his way home. Now we move to our fourth story, which takes place in the beautiful but treacherous mountains of Colorado in 2014. This is the tragic and deeply mysterious case of Dr. Jim McGrogan. To truly understand this story, you have to understand who Jim was. He was a highly respected 39-year-old medical doctor who lived in Indiana. He was married to a loving wife and was the father of 2 young children. Jim was a man who lived life to the fullest. He was in peak physical condition, frequently competing in demanding triathlons and marathons. But his true passion was the great outdoors. He was a highly competent mountaineer, rock climber, and backcountry skier. He was not an amateur who took unnecessary risks. He respected the mountains and understood how quickly conditions could turn deadly. In early March of 2014, Jim decided to organize a trip with a group of close friends to go splitboarding in Colorado. A splitboard is a specialized snowboard that can be split into 2 ski-like pieces, allowing a climber to hike up a snowy mountain and then assemble the pieces back into a snowboard to ride down. He chose a highly scenic but challenging trail located directly across the valley from the world-famous Vail Ski Resort. Because Jim was a deeply responsible family man, he wanted to reassure his wife that he was taking every safety precaution. Before leaving Indiana, he enrolled in and completed a specialized wilderness survival course and an avalanche preparedness class. He wanted to ensure that if the worst should happen, he would have the skills to survive. When they arrived in Colorado, Jim rented his splitboard and purchased top-of-the-line survival gear. The next morning, Jim and his group arrived at the trailhead ready to begin their climb. Jim's backpack was heavily loaded with professional-grade gear. He had his cell phone, an extra fully charged battery, a high-end GPS unit with offline mapping, a sturdy 4-season tent, a warm sleeping bag, matches, a compass, plenty of food, and several liters of water. He also wore an active avalanche beacon on his chest. He was, by all accounts, incredibly well prepared. The group began their ascent up the mountain. By 10 o'clock that morning, the trail was growing steep, and several members of the group were starting to feel the effects of the high altitude. They were tired and wanted to take a rest break. Jim, however, was in spectacular physical condition and felt completely energized. He did not want to stop. He told his friends that he was going to hike just a little bit further up the trail and that he would meet them at their next pre-planned rest stop. Because they all knew how capable Jim was, they did not hesitate to let him go. They told him they would see him up ahead and sat down to rest. The trail they were on was very distinct and easy to follow. It had snowed heavily that winter, and because of the high volume of hikers, the snow on the path had been packed down completely to the dark dirt beneath. The trail was a clear, dark line cutting through the deep, powdery white snow on either side. If anyone were to step off the trail, they would immediately sink waist-deep into the soft snow, leaving highly visible footprints or ski tracks. When Jim's friends finished their break and hiked to the first stop, Jim was not there. They were not worried, assuming he had simply decided to keep going to the next stop. But as they reached each subsequent stop along the route, there was no sign of Jim. Oddly, as they scanned the pristine white snow on either side of the dirt trail, they saw absolutely no footprints or ski tracks leaving the path. They began to assume he had hiked all the way to the summit and was waiting for them there. But when the group reached the final destination at 5 o'clock that evening, Jim was nowhere to be found. They had not passed him on the way up, and there was no trace of him. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, they contacted the local authorities. A massive search operation was launched. For 5 days, 3 helicopters flew grid patterns over the mountain, while teams of experienced mountaineers and scent-sniffing dogs combed the area. Because of the deep, untouched snow surrounding the trail, searchers looked specifically for any indication that someone had stepped off the path, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of a struggle, no discarded gear, and no tracks. What made this situation even more baffling was that the entire mountain area had excellent cell phone reception, and Jim had a working phone and GPS, yet no distress calls or emergency signals had been received. On the 5th day, with no clues and a heavy winter storm moving in, the active search was reluctantly called off. 20 days after Jim went missing, 2 backcountry hikers were exploring a remote canyon located a full 7 kilometers away from the trail where Jim was last seen. As they walked along the bottom of the canyon, they made a horrifying discovery. They found Jim's body lying at the base of a steep rocky cliff. He had suffered severe head trauma and a broken femur, injuries that were consistent with a fall from a great height. But the physical evidence at the scene was incredibly bizarre. Jim was wearing only a light shirt and thin leggings. His heavy winter jacket and his boots were completely missing, and searchers could not find them anywhere in the canyon. His heavy backpack was lying right next to his body. Inside the backpack, investigators found his working cell phone, his extra battery, his working GPS unit, his food, his water, and his tent. None of these life-saving items had been touched. Most baffling of all was that there were absolutely no footprints, ski tracks, or slide marks in the deep snow surrounding the spot where his body lay. The snow all around him was completely undisturbed. Furthermore, the helicopter pilots who had searched that exact canyon during the initial 5-day search insisted that they had flown over that specific spot multiple times and that there was absolutely no body there at that time. This leaves a series of deeply unsettling questions. What was Jim doing during those first 5 days? Why did he never turn on his phone or GPS to call for help? Why did he discard his boots and jacket in the freezing cold? And how did his body end up in an area of undisturbed snow miles away, days after the initial search of that exact location had concluded? Now we travel to our fifth story, which takes place in a quiet suburban town in the United Kingdom in 2014. This is a story that will make you double-check the locks on your windows and doors before you go to bed tonight. It involves a 16-year-old girl who lived in a second-floor apartment with her loving mother. She was a typical teenager who spent a lot of time on social media, especially Snapchat. One evening, she was relaxing in her bedroom, scrolling through her phone, when she received a direct message from a boy she had recently met through the app. The boy told her to go to her window and look outside, claiming he was standing right near her building. She did not know this boy very well, and the message felt incredibly creepy. She walked over to her window, parted the curtains, and peered out into the darkness, but she could not see anyone. Feeling deeply unsettled, she decided she did not want to sleep alone in her room. She walked down the hall to her mother's bedroom and asked if she could sleep in there with her that night. She was too embarrassed to mention the weird text messages, so she just climbed into bed. As she was lying there waiting to fall asleep, her phone buzzed again. It was another text from the boy. The message read, "I'm in your house." Terrified, she immediately woke her mother up and showed her the message. Her mother turned on every light in the apartment and did a thorough sweep. She checked the kitchen, the living room, and the hallways, but found absolutely no one. The doors and windows all appeared to be locked securely. The mother concluded that the boy was simply trying to scare her daughter from the outside. To be completely safe, they did another sweep, locked every entrance tightly, closed the bedroom door, and went to sleep. The next morning, the girl woke up before her mother. She decided to go back into her own bedroom to grab some clothes. But the moment she stepped across the threshold, she was hit with an intense, overwhelming feeling of being watched. She tried to shake it off and looked around her room. She checked the closet and behind the door, but saw nothing. But as she turned toward her bed, she noticed that one of her shoes was slightly out of place. She was very meticulous and organized about her belongings, and she always kept her shoes lined up in a very specific, neat row right next to her bed. She knelt down to straighten the shoe. Because her bed frame was slightly elevated, kneeling down gave her a direct line of sight underneath the bed. And as she looked under, she froze in absolute horror. Staring back at her from the darkness beneath her bed was a human face. It was the boy from Snapchat, smiling directly up at her while clutching his cell phone. The girl screamed, bolted from the room, and ran to her mother. Her mother came running into the bedroom just as the boy scrambled out from under the bed. In a panic, the boy ran to the bedroom window, flung it open, and leaped out into the yard below, escaping into the night. The boy, Kyle Ravenscraft, had developed a dangerous obsession with the girl. When he saw her leave her bedroom to go to her mother's room the night before, he had climbed up the side of the building, slipped through her open window, closed it behind him, and crawled under her bed. When the mother and daughter locked all the windows and doors, they had unknowingly locked the intruder inside the bedroom with them. Kyle was eventually arrested and given a very light sentence, but the physical and emotional toll on the young girl